Recently, my fellow history YouTuber Lindybeige uploaded a video called How Highlanders Fought, in which he demonstrated with a combat expert how Highlanders throughout the ages fought with the traditional weapons of the broadsword, or the basket-hilted broadsword as I believe it's called, and the small shield known as the Targe. However, when I was watching this video, I couldn't help but notice that it was an excellent video, of course, and that it showed how Highlanders fought each other, so one man with a Targe and a sword against another man with a Targe and a sword. However, I did think in this video they didn't really explain, and this isn't his fault at all because this was a video demonstrating Highland combat, Highlander on Highlander, but I thought why not make a video explaining how they fought against non-Targe wielding or non-Highland opponents, so the soldiers that they will have fought against. Now in this context, I want to look at how did the Highlanders fight against soldiers. The way I'll be doing this is by looking at the Jacobite Risings, which were a series of rebellions from around 1688 to 1745 with some minor ones in between, the largest in between being the 1715 Rising, with Scottish Highlanders making up a large part of the rebel forces during all of these rebellions. A little bit of context is that King James Stuart was the King of England, Scotland and Ireland. However, he was in 1688 deposed during the Glorious Revolution by none other than Willem van Oranje. The throne then went to the young Dutchman Willem van Oranje, or William III as he became known in England. He wasn't actually king of the Netherlands, he was just the stadhouder, but in England he became king of England, Scotland and Ireland. However, there were those who did not like this change, and especially in the Scottish Highlands and Islands, James and the Stuarts had a lot of support. They were, after all, Scottish in origin. And this is why the Jacobite Risings, the largest ones being in 1689, 1715 and 1745, found large support there amongst the followers of James. The name Jacobite coming from the Latin Jacobus, which means James. Of course, they wanted to put James back onto the throne. Now during these risings, of course, they were now the rebels, as the king had been deposed. So they fought against the royal soldiers, the soldiers of the government, of the British government during these conflicts. And these were, of course, the semi-professional and oftentimes professional soldiers of the government, which was a very different foe from other Highlanders. Now the Highland Charge is essentially the overall tactic of the Highlanders, and really it was a battle tactic that was employed by various Irish and Scottish forces during the Enlightenment era. Now it was used before as well, really during more melee times when everyone was using swords and spears and axes and etc. But this really continued up into the middle of the 18th century, this tactic. It had been developed, it's thought, by Irish and Scottish troops during the War of the Three Kingdoms, also known as the English Civil War, to combat various forces, and it was essentially a shock tactic. It was a full-out charge against an enemy that sought to break through the lines. Of course, these were Highland warriors. They would be charging in screaming and Gaelic and all sorts, and these would oftentimes, it would be a psychological kind of attack. They tried to break the morale of the enemy, then charge into them wielding axes and claymores, which are just these huge swords, literally meaning big sword in Gaelic, as well as basket-hilted broadswords. Whereas the enemies of the time, it was starting to shift more to ranged combat. These guys, however, were charging in, you know, pell-mell, helter-skelter, that kind of thing. Of course, their opponents would have firearms, and as the ages went on, they became more developed as well. But this didn't faze them, and actually they came up with a whole tactic that when they saw the line was about to fire, when they were charging, they would crouch down for the volley, then get back up. Those of them who had firearms would fire, and this of course would create a large smoke, and then through this smoke, through this fog of war, they would charge and then break upon the enemy, and oftentimes this was enough to completely rout an unsuspecting foe. Now as well, which is quite interesting, which I thought linked to Lindybeige's video, is that they had a very special tactic for dealing with the bayonets of the opponent. Now what they would try to do is close down the opponent, then of course they would go for a jab, but they would catch this on their Targe, at which point they would move in and dispose of their foe like so. And this was actually incredibly effective, because at this time, obviously the British soldiers, who would be used to fighting people like the French, they would fight a little bit later on in the 7 Years' War, and on the continent with the Dutch, of course, they would be fighting the French in various engagements. They would be fighting people without any armour. The age of armour really had gone by this point. But the Highlanders, they had shields, and of course with a bayonet, if you get stuck in a shield and the man is holding the sword, well, that's you finished. So this really was the Highland tactic: get in close, get psychologically involved, scare them off, and then beat them down. And this worked really quite effectively up until quite late on in history. This is essentially a tactic that had been used since the start of warfare, the kind of charge-in tactic, and it was still being used up until 1745. And it said the Highlanders are of such a quick motion that if a battalion keep up his fire to be sure of hitting them, they are upon it before our men can come to the second defence, which is the bayonet in the muzzle of the musket. So essentially they're saying that they were so fast in the charge in upon the enemy that they could hardly react and get their bayonets in place before they were upon them. And obviously in melee combat, it's thought that the Highlanders would definitely have the upper hand in this. And it's true as well that they were using oftentimes the government forces in the early Jacobite engagements, the plug bayonet, which meant that once you plugged in your bayonet you could no longer fire because the barrel obviously is then filled with this bayonet. So they would fire, and then as the Jacobites were coming on them, as the Highlanders were charging, they would have to then get their bayonets in place. But obviously when you have 400, 500, 600 angry Highlanders charging towards you with huge swords and axes and clubs and what have you, it's quite hard to calmly put your bayonet in. And this failed several times. For example, the Battle of Cuillin is the famous example. And actually, after the Battle of Cuillin, the commander of the government forces sat down, Hugh Mackay was his name, and he thought, how can we do this better? How can we make it that when we're being charged down by a foe, and obviously the men are not as calm, their fingers will be shaking madly, so it's very hard to fit in this bayonet. And he came up with a new design that was called the socket bayonet. And this bayonet obviously then went around the muzzle so that you could still fire. So you could begin an engagement if you knew you were going to be charged by a melee minded foe, then you could obviously put your bayonet on at the start of the battle and then not have to fiddle around with it when you have, hundreds of Jacobites charging towards you a few feet away. And it's tactics like this that really lessened the effect of the Highland Charge. Now the Highland Charge was attempted to break through, it was more psychological, but now that they were ready for them with these bayonets, it was less of an issue because they wouldn't be fumbling with bayonets at the last minute as the Highlanders are coming on them. It's also things like the new bayonet drill, which was used very effectively in 1746, the last real battle of the Jacobite Risings at Culloden Moor, which was that instead of attacking the man in front of you, where the Highlanders would use their favourite tactic of catching the blow into their targe and then slashing down with their weapons, they would actually turn and not attack the man in front, but attack the man to their right, who was obviously expecting the attack to come from the man in front of him. And then catching him off guard, they would bypass the targe and stab, and this worked very effectively. As well, at the Battle of Culloden, the Highland army was absolutely exhausted. They'd attempted a night attack the night before, and they'd been in full retreat across England. Many of them were there were arrears in pay. They obviously hadn't eaten, some of them, in quite a long time, so the army was in no state for battle. And as well, the terrain of Culloden just absolutely wasn't what the Jacobites needed for such an open style of warfare. You want a nice, where it's not too open, you want possibly to be on a hill so you can charge downhill onto an enemy so you've got the momentum. Definitely not a moorland, you definitely don't want anything like a bog. And they essentially charged across a bog to reach the enemy line. And all of these factors really brought an end to the Highland Charge. The last time it was really used was at the Battle of Culloden. And this is where the Jacobite cause essentially died, at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. Alright everyone, so thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. It's a little bit more of a extra explanation, if you will, on the Highland way of warfare, about how they fought against non-Highland opponents, which will have been mostly in the Jacobite Risings as explained. Now I do hope you have enjoyed this. If you'd like to see more videos on the Jacobites or about this kind of warfare, then please do let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the little bell notification, because I know a lot of people have been saying they can't see my videos, which is really annoying, and I'd hate for you guys to miss out, because I think you'll really enjoy some of the stuff that's coming up. So thank you very much for watching. I have been History with Hilbert. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up. Check out Lindybeige's video, it will of course be in the description below. Awesome channel if you haven't checked it out, but I'm sure you all will have, because you're all that cool. Alright everyone, I've been History with Hilbert, and I hope you all have a very good day.